say something a little controversial. I think it is definitely the situation vis-a-vis truth in the modern world is terrible.
Right.
But perhaps Rorty's ideas are actually quite useful at explaining why it is people believe these things that don't have a factual relationship to reality in the sense of, being able to predict or causally explain nature. And yet they still believe them and they think they're true. And they're misguided, a lot of them. They're arrogant. Some of them are narcissists. A lot of them are con men. But the average American who believes in these things believes it's true by methodology that we don't quite understand according to a certain way of life. And that has value. It maintains something in them. They must believe on some level that the institutions of science or politics, which is so used to being very calculating and putting nature to the torture, has kind of failed them. It's missed something important about human life. And so their revolt against reason, as rational, as horrible as it is expressing something. Or do you think it's just quackery? There's no...
I think it's the idols of... It's what Bacon calls the idols. I mean, but look, there's a kind of arrogance, though, which seems to be all over the internet. You can think you know better than people who've given their lives to something. You can't. I mean, there's a lot of talk about arrogant elites, but one of the things you learn when you work at a university is how little you know about the work that people are doing, particularly in the scientific departments. It wouldn't occur to me to, give people my take on microbiology in the microbiology department. I agree that you can look into why people are discontented, and it's true, a lot of voters are low information voters. But they're also deliberately misled, I think. It's not just that, they spontaneously, altogether, generated these views. I mean, for a start, the most popular television station in America, owned by Murdoch, is a full-on propaganda operation that Hannah Arendt would recognize. He doesn't care. He doesn't care. It has an audience. It's the most watched news. If it's bad news for the administration, they play it down. It gets 1 minute or not mentioned. So I think you're underestimating the extent to which people are just manipulated in this time, or they fall under the spell of internet influencers who know nothing. Do people have legitimate complaints? Sure they do. But typically, nothing that's being proposed to them in this current environment, though, is going to speak to them. Donald Trump told them he'd bring prices down on day one. Well, first of all, anybody who believes that's an idiot, because no president could, as it were, wave a magic wand and bring prices down. No matter how progressive or reactionary, it can't be done. There are features of supply and demand that can't be overridden. I mean, you could find different ways to share the stuff, I suppose, but you couldn't get more of it. Just so one way or another, you'd have to do with less if supply were low. Some of these promises made by politicians are just magical. But the thing is, I can accept some of what you say, but Rorty doesn't say that. That's the trouble. He thinks we can only choose between solidarity and objectivity. But I think the ordinary notion of objectivity has nothing to do with what he calls the correspondence theory of truth. It has to do with how you control your investigations. It's just a local business of what specific methods of inquiry are appropriate to specific problems. So Rorty's looking at it from the stratospheric level. But there's no useful advice to be given from that level, least of all in politics. So I think he just got misled by his own philosophy. He had perfectly specific ideas, in fact, but they weren't widely accepted. But that didn't mean some of them weren't good ideas. And it doesn't mean they might not have been objectively accessible, no matter how many people agreed with them.
But I do agree that, broadly speaking, objectivity, as we understand it in the scientific world, has little to do with correspondence. It usually has to do with results or with a theoretical coherence of a model. And I'm not anti-science, and I don't know microbiology, and I do take vaccines, and I like taking vaccines. So I do want to agree with all of that, but it is a fairly common prejudice to simply say that, well, this is impossible because it is factually impossible, and there's category errors that get made. So, for instance, regarding kind of like supply and demand, that is one way to organize an economy, but it's not a fact of nature. It's to conceive of an economy through market logic is a modern innovation, but people act as if though it's a property of the thing in itself, as it were. And the same happens with gender, the same happens with race. That kind of stratospheric level where people use the real world as a kind of culture, it's been done, and it has been, and it will be done again.
Yeah, here's the thing about Rorty, though. He was quite an old-fashioned leftist in some ways. I think in the end, all politics for him was class politics. And he didn't actually like that much the identitarian development in the Democratic Party, in part because he thought it would stand in the way of the solidarity that would be necessary to make society less cruel. I think that was one of his convictions, as a matter of fact. And I don't think that's a trivial worry, as a matter of fact. It's entire, I'm hoping for a democratic blowout in the midterms. But on some of the culture war issues, I think, in fact, the Democratic Party is probably out of step with the majority. So you might need to be a little more flexible.
How do you prevent the majorities worshipping of idols in one area, but then say, well, we must kowtow to their idols because it's...
I don't think you have to kowtow. Sometimes some issues have to be put off in order to make progress on a different front. You don't have to just give in. There's no that I think is a false dichotomy. But you have to live in the real world also. I mean, things could get very, very bad if they stay on the current trajectory. They're bad enough already in Minneapolis. So right now, I think, in a sense, there's almost a crisis. Well, not almost a crisis. There is a crisis. And some people might have to not renounce, but defer long-term goals. Or they're going to get into a situation where their long-term goals will become ever more unrealizable. And that's just the real world, I think.
You're not feeling the burn.
I won't live to see it, but so you'll get to see who's right.
Yeah. I'm going to look at this minimalism thing. So the idea is that if the notion of truth is thin enough, it's so thin that even something as thick as a form of life can't touch it and make us into something like relativists. The sort of
That's right. That's a virtue, I think. Yeah.
Right. Does Rorty have the resources to say that somebody who accepts something like a deflationary view of truth is perhaps like a prime example of somebody giving their final vocabulary? Which is just to say, there's in the process of denying there's anything theoretically or substantially interesting about truth.
I think, Richard, you're still wanting something that minimalists don't want, and I don't want.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly happy to talk about ways to organize life. But I think that's the level on which we always have to talk. Truth talk is just something that comes later. There's the endorsing use, there's the querying use. But the real argument is at ground level. It's not at that meta level about what people say.
So, first of all, it was very interesting. So there is this distinction between the deflationary view, or the disquotational view, on which it's sentences. We think of sentences.
Yeah, that I don't believe to describe.
Me neither. The minimalist view is about propositions, and of course, you might wonder, okay, now we're going to do our theoretical work on instead of truth. But what I found so interesting was, I don't know if this view has a name, but it's combining deflationism about truth with the view that the truth bearers are something like speech acts in context. Statements in context, sorry, statements in context. Okay, so one reason I think that's interesting is because statements in context, you mentioned yesterday how you worried about a kind of maybe quasi-conservatism in what you were saying about the Pyrrhonian skeptic and the way they approach things. And I do wonder whether or not there is a tilt towards something similar in a particular view of truth, insofar as one of the reasons we get preoccupied with the nature of truth, why we end up semantically assenting, why we go beyond just simply talking in first order terms and think about what does it mean in general for something to be true, is because we encounter difficult new contexts, difficult new situations, right? Ones where we just, don't think we don't yet know exactly what rule we were following all along.
That's all right, but you see, from my standpoint, it's just a thin logical concept. It's like expecting help from, the material implication sign. It ain't gonna happen.
I know, Michael, but semantic paradoxes exist.
I don't take them seriously. That's, well, that's because I think they're silly sentences. They don't actually, you go in and you write, the only sentence on this board is false. And then you try to say, this shows some deep logical problem about talk of true and false. And the answer is, the hell it does. That's a sentence that has no use outside stupid classes like this. That's the correct attitude, for me. I don't think that the conquest of analytic philosophy by formal logic was the triumph that Russell and Carnap and et hoc genus omne thought that it was. And maybe we'll get back to talking about things that actually mean something to somebody. Outside, look, if people like to play with those paradoxes, be my guest. Some people like to play golf. I agree with Winston Churchill. A good walk spoiled.
Okay, so how should we understand the science of language, or is there one?
Science of language?
Yeah, linguistics. No. Linguistics. Semantics.
I don't think so, really. Maybe there's some theoretical interest, in of course he's way back from it now, but Chomsky's idea of universal grammar and stuff. It is kind of empirically testable. It could. Sometimes Bacon is wrong about this. There are some scientific things you could look into just for the sheer pleasure of understanding. That, of course, sometimes though, even those things turn out, totally blue sky, turn out to have applications that you didn't foresee. Often you don't see the applications till you get the result. There's something else though that I think philosophy. I'm a fan of science, but I think we also in philosophy ignore engineers. When I used to teach a history of modern philosophy, every student's heard of Newton. Virtually nobody has ever heard of Thomas Newcomen. What did this guy do? he made the first industrial application of a steam engine. He found that you could burn fossil fuels to do useful mechanical work. I think that did more to change the world we live in than learning to predict the positions of the planets a bit better. I mean, and yet, who remembers him, right? And yet, in the 18th century, then, all his thing could do was just pump water out of mines by going up and down. But then James Watt showed how you could lay it down, put it to a crank, and drive machines. And by the first years of the 19th century, 1801 or 2, Richard Trevithick, another Cornishman, had a little railway track, circular railway track in London, and a puffing train going around it. And, the railways made America as we know it. I'm reading a terrific book, actually, about that right now. It's some volume in the Oxford History of America about the transformation. And, of course, it was the railway that made this continental-sized political unit into a country. There's the Great Battle of New Orleans, where they defeated the British soldiers, First of all, the two countries weren't technically at war anymore. They signed a peace treaty in Ghent, but the news hadn't made it across the Atlantic, so they were fighting the battle in complete ignorance, and it used to take 3 weeks to get from New Orleans to Washington, D.C. With the news of the result, except that year there'd been particularly bad weather, so it took a month. So meanwhile, the Congress is debating the Congress of the War in utter ignorance. We forget how much space and time was shrunk by these developments. And many of these had to do with these tinkerers, not just with theoretical science. In fact, thermodynamics really grew out of interest in the problem of making steam engines more efficient. The actual... It's an unusual case for Bacon. This was a case where the machines actually preceded the detailed theoretical investigation of their principles. Of course, it depended on the discovery of air pressure by Torricelli and others in the 17th century. The first engine. It was called the atmospheric engine. That was its name. So it's a complicated story, I think, but not much to do with truth.
We got a question from Keith and another question.
I want to ask you about the connection between philosophy and politics, if there is one.
Yeah, there isn't much. There's no connection between my view of truth and politics.
It struck me, you've argued that some of Rorty's views haven't gone well, and in this critique of truth, effectively he's kind of thrown the baby out of the bathwater. I'm just wondering if you think, in any sense, either Rorty's philosophy or pragmatism or philosophy more generally is part of the reason why we're in this mess, and if you think it has any role in getting us out of it, or are these kind of arcane philosophical issues just kind of epiphenomenal with respect?
That's a good question. In a way, I'm inclined to think the answer is no. But it might be because I have some Hegelian sympathies that, the owl of Minerva flies at night, as it were. In other words, we understand a lot of things retrospectively, in other words, but they're rarely that driven solely by our philosophical ideas as we might think at the time. But looking back, we can see what the factors were. It's hard to know. I think if you take one of the most successful movements, that really truly revolutionary movements in Britain, which was the suffragette movement, I don't think it was really driven by deep philosophical convictions. It was driven by the way women were treated. Why didn't they have the vote? Why was it only men who got to vote? It's not like they didn't have any interests that could be represented in Parliament. And that seemed very concrete to people. It would directly affect their lives. No, I mean, you could talk more abstractly about, philosophically about equality and so forth, but I don't think that makes a political movement. People need to see something that has an immediate effect. I mean, I think if anything, then people's final vocabularies might change a bit, but I doubt they'd have any doubts about them because they were forged by the political struggle. They weren't forged by reading and reflecting, as Rorty thinks, on the ways things have been. I mean, they were, and the same thing with trade unions, all things like that. They grow out of concrete problems and people's solutions to them, I think. I think philosophy comes later, the rationalization.
I guess we have just one more question. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much for the last 2 minutes. I left here 40 years ago, graduating in philosophy, calling myself a skeptical realist. I'm not sure of the last 2 nights you've I don't know, maybe less skeptical, but at least this evening you made me less skeptical about deflationary accounts of truth. Not entirely exercised, but thanks for the understanding of that. But I was struck by what you were saying about Roger Bacon, his understanding of scientific truth.
Francis Bacon.
Excuse me, Francis Bacon.
Roger's a medieval guy.
All of science is not pure understanding, and I'm reminded of some folks who really annoy me, probably as much as brains and bats and matrices annoy you, social constructivists, who Nancy Carter talks about science not being a replica of the very laws that God wrote, and the laws of science are true of the world as we made it, not the world as we have found it. She goes on to say the laws of physics are true only of what we make. Now, I note that you talked about Rorty and his anti-truth or withdrawal for truth, maybe that is overdone. What is your reading on these social constructivist accounts of truth? Do you believe?
Well, I don't read Nancy. I like Nancy Cartwright, and I like Nancy Cartwright's philosophy. I don't think I see her though as strictly a social constructivist. I mean, in some ways, I think she's more like a pragmatist. I mean, you could think of. You can think of a lot of scientific views as kind of useful models in certain conditions. Like, an obvious example is the ideal gas law, right? So relating pressure, volume, and temperature in a closed container. So it's a severe idealization of reality. It assumes that the particles are infinitesimally small, compared with the space they occupy, that the distances between them are very great, that collision with each other and with the walls of the container is perfectly elastic, so nothing is lost. But the ideal gas law works very, very well over a huge temperature range. When you get very, very cold or at very high pressure and the particles get close together, then it breaks down. But, because intermolecular forces are now important. But there's no more general theory that governs the adjustments you have to make because they are specific to the element that makes up the gas. So you have to add something called the van der Waals correction. So there is no more. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean the ideal gas law is a bad thing. I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, it gives statistical mechanics.
Well, would you think of science that can only ever be empirically adequate within some social context? Now, scientists themselves, like you.
Well, it's not just a social context, though. I mean, look. If you violate these laws in an engineering application, your plane falls out of the sky. That's what. Look, Bacon says we ask the questions, but nature gives the answer. That's the whole idea of controlled experimentation. You get to set up the condition, but you don't get to manipulate the result. That was Bacon's big claim about putting nature to the torture. So you control the conditions under which you manipulate some variable. But you don't get to predict the outcome. Something that is uncontrolled. You leave it to nature to determine what's going to happen in the situation you set up. It's interesting, I never talked about it yesterday, but there's one thing where Sextus's criticism of theories of the criterion in the academics is very weak. They had a doctrine of the tested impression. I won't go into all the details, but one of the examples is somebody comes into a room, it's pretty dark, the oil lights have gone out, and he sees something coiled up in the corner. And it might be a snake, but it might just be a coil of rope. So he gets a stick and he gives it a poke. Nothing happens. Of course, it might be a particularly kind of dormant snake, but at least it's not going to react quickly, so you go a bit closer. Give it a whack. Still nothing happens. Then you go take a look. It's a coil of rope. And Sextus says, oh, it's just a criterion, you know, typical of these guys. Nobody believes that one. Some people believe other things. But in a microcosm, it's really controlled experimentation. I mean, and it's learning. By you actively engage with the world. You don't just observe the world and see what happens.
Not to make it behave in the way you want it to behave. You thought, and the way it's talked about here, the laws only true of what you make, which is maybe this is from one paper of Cartwright that I read, but it sounds very much like we take a piece of reality, shove it in the entirely artificial context of that, and make it obey the laws.
Yeah, but there's some truth to that because, you know, at scale, of course, at scale, you're always interacting with many more factors than you control in experiments. You're just right about that. But Bacon was right about what you could now learn. I mean, look at what we could do with what we found out. I mean, I live in a world. Now, we live in a world that was science fiction when I was a college student. You know, in England, the telephone was something that had to be wired up to telephone wires. And you had to apply, and maybe 6 months later, you might get one from the post office if you were lucky. You know, and you know, now, you got an iPhone. I mean, even automatic doors were non-existent. You know, I mean, when like Star Trek was on TV, you know, they had these automatic doors. Of course, what they were is the two guys behind the set were invisibly pulling the door open and closing it again. It's not that they had doors controlled by photocells. I mean, and you know, cars, automobiles were ridiculously unreliable and slow and dangerous in many ways. You know, right? I mean, the world has, but the world has changed. I mean, dramatically. And there are, of course, just serendipitous discoveries. I mean, AI is partly one of them. I think. I mean, the chips that are made by NVIDIA were originally made for computer games. Nobody thought they had any particularly interesting use, but it turns out they could be adapted to do massive parallel processing. And that's the basis of the machines that can run LLMs. So, you know, I mean, that wasn't experimental. I mean, I suppose there was some experimental science that had gone into the original design of these things for what they were designed for, which was basically for images, for computer games. But then they turned out to be able to do things that nobody had thought of.